The water came up through the market stones before any of us understood the river had left its bed. One breath the lane between the fish stalls and the tanner's shed was only puddled with the morning's rain, and the next it was a brown, muscled thing shoving barrels off their stacks and dragging a cart sideways with a shriek of wet wood. I had come down into Thistledown in a plain traveling cloak and mud on my boots, as I did most market days, to walk among my own people as a man and not a crown. And so I was standing in the wrong lane with no guard and no name anyone knew when the flood took the lower town. People were already running the right way, uphill, clutching children and chickens and whatever their arms could hold. I turned the wrong way downhill, because downhill was where the shouting was, and shouting has always pulled at me the way a scent pulls at a hound. The shouting belonged to a woman. She was up to her thighs in the flood at the very lip of the lane, where a low fenced yard butted against the town wall, and she was not running from the water. She was wading into it, hauling on a rope with both hands, her sleeves shoved past her elbows and her braid come half loose and plastered to her neck, and she was roaring a stream of instructions at nobody, at the water, at the fence, at the sky. "Hold, hold, you miserable planks, don't you dare, not the far pen, get the latch," in the voice of a woman who fully expected the world to obey her, and was furious that today it wouldn't. Behind her fence, in a yard that was filling fast, animals were drowning. Not livestock for market. I saw that even from the lane. A three-legged fox stood on the only high spot, a mounded compost heap, screaming its thin fox scream. An old hound with milk-white eyes turned its blind head this way and that. There were pens, a whole crooked warren of little pens and hutches and lean-to shelters, and in them I could see the small, frantic shapes of creatures that could not climb and could not swim. A goat with a splinted leg, a clutch of orphaned wolf pups no bigger than my two fists, a heron with one wing bound to its side, a knot of rabbits, a badger, a goose that had already given up on dignity and was simply shrieking. The woman had a rope tied to the gate of the nearest low pen, and she was trying to drag the whole pen bodily up onto the compost mound before the water got over its walls. The rope was winning. She was losing, and she was too stubborn to know it yet. I did not think. That has always been my trouble, whatever my counsel says of me. A king is supposed to think first. I went over her fence. "You," she gasped, not even looking at me properly, just registering a large shape arriving in her flood. "Good, take this, pull." I took the rope. I pulled. I am a Lycan King. I have pulled warships off sandbars and dragged fallen stone off trapped men. I put my whole back into it, meaning to spare her the strain, and the sodden pen, which was never built for a Lycan's pull, simply came apart in the middle. The gate ripped free in my hands. One whole wall of the pen peeled away and went sailing off on the current, and the little goat with the splinted leg went straight into the flood. I have relived that moment more times than any battle I ever fought. The goat did not drown. I want that said plainly because of the way she looked at me, and because for one heartbeat I thought it would, and something in me, some old buried thing I had made peace with never using, lurched toward the water after it. The goat swam. Goats swim better than kings deserve. It paddled, indignant, to the compost mound, and heaved itself up beside the fox, and stood there streaming and bleeding its outrage at the entire enterprise. But she did not know it would swim, in the moment. In the moment, she saw a stranger she had trusted with a rope tear her pen in half and pitch a splint-legged goat into a flood. She rounded on me. I want to tell you about the bond now, because this is where it happened, and I have never been able to tell it in the right order since. 200 years I had ruled Sunhello without a mate. My father before me the same, and his father, and hers before that, the whole long line of us, the Vales, the wolf kings of the Sun Hollow, and not one of us in living memory had ever felt the fated bond strike. Moonforsaken, the old wives called us, kindly enough, the way you'd call a childless couple unlucky. The fated mate is the deepest promise our kind believes in, that somewhere the moon has already made you a second half, and that when you meet her the wolf inside you wakes and knows, past all doubt there, that one always. Every wolf in my kingdom grew up on those stories. I grew up on the footnote to them, except the kings. The kings wait and no one comes. I had made my peace with the footnote. I am not saying I made it gladly, but I made it. By 50, I had stopped scanning rooms. By 100, I could sit through a betrothal feast for one of my lords and feel nothing worse than a dull ache behind the ribs, like the memory of a tooth long pulled. By 200, I had let my steward, good old Hollies, begin his gentle campaign to have me name an heir from the cousin line and be done with it. Because the Vale Wolf did not wake, and everyone agreed it never would, and there is a kind of comfort in a thing being finally settled. So I was settled. I want you to understand how settled I was, standing thigh-deep in a flood in a stranger's yard with a broken gate in my hands. She turned around, streaming and wild-eyed, her braid unraveling, mud to her elbows, and she opened her mouth to tell me exactly what she thought of me. And the wolf woke. Not a stir, not a lurch. He did not go still the way the stories always say, that reverent hush. Mine did the opposite. 200 years he had lain folded shut somewhere under my breastbone like a thing pressed in a book. And now all at once, with no warning and no dignity whatsoever, he unfolded. He came up through me like sunrise coming up a valley wall, warm and enormous and absurdly, helplessly glad. And he looked out through my eyes at a furious woman in a flooded yard who was about to call me every name she knew, and he sat down. I felt him do it. I felt him sit down inside me in the mud and thump his tail. Her, he said in the wordless way the wolf says things. There, that one, always. I stood there with her broken gate in my hands and the water rising past my knees, and I could not have spoken to save the goat, the town, or my own crown. Of all this she was saying, are you deranged? Did nobody ever teach you that a rope is for pulling steadily? You don't just you heaved, you great ox, you heaved on a wet pen with a lame goat in it. Do you have any idea? She wrenched the gate out of my slack hands and flung it away into the current. Don't touch anything else, don't touch anything. Stand there. Stand exactly there and be a post I can tie things to. Can you do that? Can you be a post? She's magnificent, said my wolf. She is calling us an ox, I told him. She noticed our shoulders, said my wolf, delighted. She said, great ox. That's the shoulders, she likes the shoulders. I would like to report that I mastered the situation. I did not. I stood in the flood and I was a post. She looped rope around my forearm and used me as an anchor, and I held the whole tottering warren of pens against the current with my back while she went from hutch to hutch on the high side, snatching up sodden creatures and flinging them to the compost mound. The wolf pups first, 4 of them dumped unceremoniously against the goat's flank where they clung and shrieked. Then the heron, then the rabbits by the double handful, then the badger who bit her and whom she carried anyway. She was crying, I realized, somewhere in there, not weakly, furiously. She wept the way she shouted, as an act of defiance against a world that would drown a blind hound if she looked away. And every tear seemed to make her stronger and angrier and more magnificent, and my wolf watched her through my eyes and would not stop thumping his fool tail. By the time the water crested and began, sullenly, to draw back down toward the river where it belonged, she had saved every creature in that yard. Every one. The badger, the goat, the fox, the goose, the blind hound she carried out last in both arms with its old head tucked under her chin. She stood on the compost mound, soaked to the bone, surrounded by a shivering menagerie, and she looked down at me still standing in the sinking flood with her rope around my arm, and she wiped her face with a muddy wrist, and she said, quite calmly now, in a voice gone rough with shouting, "You can stop being a post." "I'm sorry about the goat," I said. It was the first thing I had managed to say to her. 200 years of waiting and a lifetime of a king's careful speech, and that was what came out. I'm sorry about the goat. She looked at me for a long moment. The rain had thinned to nothing. Behind her the sun was trying weakly to get out. And some of the fury went out of her face and left behind only tiredness and a wary, assessing kind of curiosity, as though she were recataloguing me from disaster to possible tool. "The goat's fine," she said. "The goat swims. Everyone always forgets the goat swims." She pushed a wet strand off her face. "You've got a good back on you, terrible hands, no sense at all, but a good back." She said it the way you'd appraise a draft horse. My wolf swooned. "There's a mountain of work here now and half the town's underwater. If you've nowhere to be, you can stay and be useful. Can you carry?" "I can carry," I said. "Then carry." She was already turning away, already moving to the next 100 things. "And it's linnet, since you'll be underfoot." "What do I call you?" There was a moment, one clean, quiet moment, where I could have said it. Torin Vale. And she would have gone white and gone to her knees the way people do, and it would have become a different thing entirely, a subject and her king, and the rope would have come off my arm and never gone back on, and the wolf who had just woken after 200 years would have gone back to being a secret I carried alone. "Torin," I said, just that. The name my mother used, not the name the heralds cry. "Torin," she tested it, found it acceptable, filed it away. Well, Torin, welcome to the worst day of my year. Grab the hound. I grabbed the hound. And that, whatever the ballads may eventually make of it, is how it began. With a broken gate, a swimming goat, a woman who thought I was an ox, and a wolf who had waited 2 centuries to wake and had chosen, of all the moments the moon might have given him, the exact instant a stranger was calling me useless in a flood. I should have gone back to Highhearth that night. The hold sits above the town on the shoulder of the hill, all warm stone and firelight, and by dusk hollies would have half the guard combing the flood lanes for their vanished king, imagining me drowned in a gutter, composing in his head the careful grief speech he'd give the cousin line. I owed it to him to go up the hill and be a crown again. Instead, I carried a blind hound named Barnaby to higher ground, and then I carried lumber, and then I carried water, clean water, hauled up from the good well because the flood had fouled everything. And then it was full dark and Lynette was still working by lantern light in the wreck of her yard, splinting the goat's leg afresh where the swim had knocked it crooked, and I found I could not make my feet carry me up the hill and out of her flood. "You're still here," she observed, around a piece of cord she was holding in her teeth. "You said there was a mountain of work." "I say a lot of things." She tied off the splint. The goat bore it with the weary contempt of a creature that has been through worse today. "Most men take the first excuse. The good back and no sense. I had you pegged for a man who'd be gone by noon." "I've nowhere I need to be," I said, which was the largest lie I had ever told, and also, standing in that lantern-lit yard, the truest thing I knew. She sat back on her heels and really looked at me then, the way she looked at a hurt animal to decide what was wrong with it. It is an unsettling thing to be looked at that way by the only person in the world who has ever looked at you without first seeing the crown. My whole life people had looked at me and seen King, seen what they wanted from me, or feared from me, or hoped for. Lynette looked at me and saw a large, tired man with good shoulders and no sense who had stayed to help her badger bite him, and she seemed to find that both suspicious and, grudgingly, all right. "There's straw in the dry shed," she said finally. "It doesn't smell as bad as you'd think. If you're set on being a stray, you may as well be a stray with a roof, but you earn it. First light, we start on the far fence." "She's offering us a den," my wolf said, scandalized with joy. "She's offering us a straw shed because she thinks we're homeless," I said. "A den," insisted my wolf. I slept in the straw shed of a woman who thought I was a vagrant, 3 miles below a hold where 100 servants would have wept to see it, and I slept better than I had in a decade. That was the pattern of the days that followed, and I will not pretend I found it a burden. Each dawn I woke in the straw to the smell of her lighting the fire and the outrage of the goose, and I worked. I mended fence and dug drainage and re-roofed the hutches. I learned the creatures' names, which she rattled off as though I were slow for not knowing them. Barnaby the blind hound, Mistress the biting badger, the goat who had no name because you don't name a goat, they think it makes them people, and the 4 wolf pups whom she had not named either because she did not expect to keep them. "They're not mine," she said the 3rd morning when she caught me letting the smallest one gnaw my thumb. "Someone left them. People do, a litter turns up wolf and they get frightened and they leave them at the refuge in the night like it's my job, which it is, but wolf pups aren't for keeping. They want the wild or they want a pack. They'll pine, penned up with a goat and a heron." She frowned at the little one on my thumb. "That one's the worst of it. Won't take milk from the other's bowl, only from the hand. Going to break its heart when they go." I looked at the pup gnawing my thumb, a real wolf pup, mined, gray and fat-pawed and blunt-nosed, and I felt absurdly a lump come up in my throat because I knew a thing Lynette did not. I knew whose pups those were. I had known from the first morning, when the smallest one caught my scent and went silent and pressed itself flat and trembling against the earth in the ancient way a young wolf greets its king. These were no stray litter. These were moon wolves, the old blood, the great wolves of the royal line, the ones who had let no hand but a veil's touch them in 200 years. Someone had not abandoned them at Lynette's gate out of fear. Someone in my own hold had lost a litter from the royal kennels in the flood, and the flood had carried them down the hill, and they had washed up, of all the yards in thistledown, in hers. And they had stayed. That was the thing that made my throat close. A moonwolf pup, separated from its own, will pine and refuse and often die. These 4 had settled into a stranger's refuge, and taken her hand-fed milk and slept against her blind hound and thrived, and the smallest would take milk from no bowl but her palm. I did not tell her. I told myself I did not tell her because it would mean telling her everything, the kennels, the hold, the crown. That was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was afraid to break the spell of being, for the first time in my life, no one's king. So I let her go on believing they were strays, and I let her go on believing I was one too, and I told myself I would set it all right soon. It is remarkable how long a wise man can put off setting a thing right when the wrong of it is so warm. Now I must tell you about my wolf, because he was making everything worse. You understand by now that the bond had struck, but a bond is not a tidy thing that arrives and then behaves. Mine had woken starved, 200 years starved, and it had no sense of proportion whatsoever, and it had gotten the idea in that first flooded hour that the way Linnet showed her regard was by shouting, and I could not talk him out of it. "You've put that post in crooked," she said the fourth day, hands on her hips, glaring at a fence post I'd set. "It's leaning like a drunk. Have you got water in your eyes? Pull it and do it again." She corrected our posture, my wolf sighed, melting. "She wants us to grow. She's invested in us." "You are eating me out of house and home," she said the fifth day, watching me put away a third bowl of stew. "I've fed armies that ate less than you. Where does it go? You're not even fat, that's the insult of it. It just vanishes into you like a well." "She's noticed our appetite," my wolf said, thrilled. "She's thinking about how we're built. She said we're not fat. That's practically a proposal." "If you leave that gate open one more time," she said the sixth day when the goat had gotten into the feed again, "I will feed you to the badger, I mean it. Mistress hasn't had a proper meal in weeks, and you do nicely. Close. The gate." "She's threatening to feed us to her badger," my wolf reported in the tone of a man reading aloud a love letter. "She wants us close." "Close," she said. "She wants us close." "She wants the gate closed," I told him. "She said close, and then she said you. Close, you." "I heard it. She wants us close to her, possibly forever, and she's expressing it through the badger." "There is no version of that sentence," I said. "That is about the badger wanting to marry us." "You always do this," my wolf said, wounded. 200 years I wait, 200, and the one time she pays attention to us you want to be gloomy about it. She threw a rag at your head yesterday. Do you know what it means when a female throws something at your head?" "That she is annoyed." "It means she wants you to have the rag," said my wolf. "It's a gift. She gave us the rag." I want to be clear that I knew he was wrong. I'm a grown king, and I understood, in the sensible front of my mind, that Linnet was not courting me by calling me a drunk-cleaning ox with water in my eyes who ought to be fed to a badger. I understood that she was, in fact, simply an exasperated woman with a flooded refuge and an unhelpful stray. But there is a stubborn animal truth under the sensible part of every wolf, and mine had decided and would not be moved that every sharp word out of her was the most tender thing ever spoken to him. And the maddening part, the part I could not confess to Hollies or anyone, is that some of that gladness leaked up into me. I began to like being scolded. I who had spent 200 years being agreed with by everyone in my kingdom, whose lightest opinion was treated as law, whose jokes were laughed at before I finished them. I began to look forward, with a warmth I could not defend, to Linnet telling me I had done something wrong. Because it meant she was looking straight at me and seeing a man she could argue with, and not a crown she had to obey. That is a dangerous thing to discover about yourself, when you have not told the woman you are her king. The trouble with a warm secret is that it lives on borrowed time, and the interest comes due. Mine came due in 2 directions at once. The first was Holly's. On the 8th day, a boy came down from the hold with a folded note. I had sent word up, of course, on the 2nd morning, a single line in my own hand to keep my steward from raising the county. I am well and about the king's business in the low town. Tell no one, send nothing. Hollies, who had served my father and had earned the right, sent back nothing but that note on which he had written beneath my line in his cramped old hand, the king's business or the king's. And beneath that, the council convenes at the new moon. 9 days, come home and be seen, or come home to a decision made without you. I knew what the decision was. It was the one Hollies had been steering me toward for a decade, gently out of love. Declare the veil line moon-forsaken past hope, name my cousin Edrec's boy the heir, and let the kingdom stop holding its breath for a mate who was never coming. It was a good and reasonable plan. I had all but agreed to it a season ago. There was only the one small new difficulty, which was that the mate had come in a flood, and was at this moment 3 feet away threatening to feed me to a badger, and I had told no one, least of all her. The second reckoning came from Lynette herself, and it cut deeper. We were mending the far fence, the one that bordered the wildwood where the flood had torn out a whole run of rails, and the work had gone easy and quiet, and she was in the rare soft mood that came over her sometimes at the end of a well-worked day, and she started talking. Not shouting. Talking low, the way she did to the animals when she thought no one was listening. And what she talked about was the king. "You'll not have heard being astray," she said, driving a rail home, "but this isn't the first flood that yard's seen. 2 winters back it was the king's own doing, not water, his hunt." She spat the word. "The great autumn hunt, the king and his lords and their moon wolves thundering down out of Highhearth through the low town after some stag, no thought for what's underfoot. Went straight through the old refuge. I headed out past the mill then, trampled it flat, killed a mare I'd nursed for a year and never so much as slowed down." She set the next rail with more force than it needed. "They sent a purse after. A steward came with a fat purse and a fine speech about His Majesty's regret. Regret." She laughed, not kindly. "A man who regrets a thing doesn't do it from horseback at a gallop with his eyes on a stag. He'd never even seen us. That's the truth of kings, Torin. We're the ground under their hunt. They don't hate us. Hate would be something. They just don't see us at all, and they send a purse when they've flattened us, and they call that mercy." I stood there with a rail in my hands, and I could not feel my own face. Because I remembered that hunt. I remembered it the way you remember a day that meant nothing to you dimly, without shame, because there had been nothing at the time to be ashamed of. A good autumn. A fast stag. A hard ride down through the low town, yes, and some damage to some stalls, and Holly's at my elbow that evening with the tally of it, and my own voice, careless and kind as I believed kindness to be. Send a purse. See, they're made whole. And I had thought no more of it. I had genuinely believed I was being a good king. I had never once imagined the mare. I had never imagined her, on her knees in the wreck of her life's work, receiving my fat purse from a steward's hand and understanding, correctly, that her king did not know she was alive. "I'm sorry," I said. My voice came out wrong. "Old grief," she said, misreading it, gentling. "Don't look so stricken, it wasn't yours. You'd never gallop a mare into the mud, you great careful ox. You can't even set a straight post." She almost smiled. "That's the difference between you and a king, isn't it? You break my gate and you feel terrible, stay up half the night feeling terrible. A king breaks everything you've got and sends a purse and sleeps like a babe." She hefted the last rail. "I'll take the ox, every time. Hand me that mallet." I handed her the mallet. My wolf, for once in his glad, foolish life, was silent. That night I lay in the straw and did not sleep at all, and for the first time since the flood I did not feel warm. I felt like a liar in a straw shed. Because she had drawn me a picture of the king of Sunhallow, careless, unseeing, galloping over the small good people of his own kingdom with a purse ready in his glove. And the terrible thing, the thing that kept me staring up at the dark, was that the picture was true. Not maliciously true. I had never meant a moment of harm. But I had ruled 200 years from a height where the low town was a view, and I had learned to be kind the way you learn to be kind to a distant thing, by sending purses. I had never once, in 2 centuries, mended a stranger's fence with my own hands, or learned a goat's opinions, or sat up worrying over a splinted leg. I had thought that was because I was a king and had larger cares. I understood now, in the straw, that it was because no one had ever made me. Everyone below me had always simply forgiven me in advance for everything because I was the crown. Everyone except her. She had not forgiven me anything. She had made me set the post again, and in 9 days I was to go up the hill and put on the crown she despised and take my place as exactly the man she'd take the ox over every time. I thought that night that the wisest and kindest thing I could do was to go before the reckoning came, before the reveal broke her flood open all over again. To slip up the hill in the dark and be the king and never come back down, and let Torin the Stray simply vanish, a man who drifted in with the flood and drifted out again, leaving her fences mended and her heart untouched. I even got as far as sitting up in the straw with my boots in my hands. The smallest wolf pup was asleep against my ribs. It had crept in sometime in the night, as it had taken to doing, the moon wolf pup that would take milk from no one's bowl, that had known me for its king from the first hour, and told no one. That pined for a pack it had lost and had chosen, in the pack's place, to sleep against the 2 people in that yard who did not know what it was, the stray and the mender. It lay curled against my side, warm and trusting and entirely at peace, and I understood, holding my boots in the dark, that I could not do the wise thing. Not because of the crown. Because of her and the pup, and the fact that for 8 days I had been, for the first time in my long, careful life, at home. And a man does not sneak out of the one home he has ever had with his boots in his hands, no matter how wise it would be. I put the boots down, the pup sighed. I would not run, I would tell her. I would tell her the whole of it, the crown, the kennels, the pups, the hunt that killed her mare, and I would let her be as furious as she had every right to be. And I would stand there and be a post for her fury the way I'd been a post for her rope. And then, when it had run its course, I would ask her, not command, ask whether there was any road back for a king who had learned, too late and by accident, to mend a fence. I meant to tell her the next morning. I did not get the next morning. The reckoning does not wait for a man to be ready. It came up the lane at dawn on horseback, in the person of Hollies, who had run out of patience and decency both, and had come down the hill himself to fetch his king home, and who rode into the refuge yard, spotted me in the straw with the royal pups tumbling round my feet, went white with relief and fury, dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, and dropped to one knee in the mud of Linnet's yard. "Your Majesty," said Hollies at the top of his old lungs, "thank the moon, the whole hold has sire, you cannot simply." Linnet was in the doorway of the feed shed, with a bucket in each hand. I have faced war. I have stood in the breach of a wall with the enemy coming through. I have never in my life felt anything to match the moment Linnet stood in that doorway with a bucket in each hand, and watched my steward kneel in her mud, and call the stray in her straw, "Shed, your Majesty." The buckets did not drop. I remember being distantly astonished that the buckets did not drop. She set them down, very carefully, one and then the other, without ever taking her eyes off me. And the color went out of her face, and then came back into it all at once, red. And I watched 2 winters of trampled refuge, and a dead mare, and a fat purse, and 8 days of a lying stray in her straw arrive behind her eyes at the same instant. And I understood that I had once again, at exactly the wrong moment, broken every gate she had. "Linnet," I said, "I can." "Don't," she said. And she came across the yard at me with her fists clenched, and Hollies flinched up from his knee to put himself between his king and the furious woman, and I put my hand out and stopped him, because I would sooner have taken her blow than her being stopped from giving it, and she pulled up short a foot away, shaking, and did not strike me. She just looked up at me, close, the way she'd looked at me in the flood, recataloguing, and this time what she catalogued me as broke something in her voice. "You," she said, "you, all this time, in my straw, eating my stew, letting me, I made you set the post again, I threatened to feed you to my badger, I told you about the mare." Her voice cracked clean through. "I told you about the king, to your face. I drew you a picture of the careless, unseeing, purse-sending." She stopped, understanding landed. "It was your hunt, 2 winters back, the mare, that was you." "Yes," I said, there was no other honest word. "And you knew," she said. "Yesterday, at the fence, when I told it, you knew, and you stood there and let me, and you said I'm sorry like a stray." "I was sorry," I said. "I am more than I have ever." "Don't," she stepped back. Her hands had unclenched. That was worse. Fury I could have stood in front of all day. What came after the fury drained away was the flat, tired look of a woman who has just watched the one thing she'd let herself trust turn out to be exactly the thing she'd always known it would be. "Get off my land," she said. "You and your steward and your—" She gestured at the pups and then faltered because the pups were tumbling adoringly round my boots, and even in that moment she was too honest not to feel the wrongness of it. "Whatever those are, get off my land, your Majesty, and take your purse hand off my fences. I built them fine before a king came to break them." Hollies drew a breath to speak, some smoothing courtly thing, some His Majesty intends only, and I stopped him with a look. He deserved better than to be dragged into this. It was mine to carry. "I'll go," I said to her. "I'll go now, and I won't come back, and you'll never see me on your land again unless you send for me." I said it, and my wolf howled inside me, a real howl, the first grief note he'd made in 200 years, and I held him. "But I'll say the one true thing first, and then I'll go, and you can throw it in the flood with the gate if you like." She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She stood there with her jaw set, giving me nothing, which for Linnet was a kind of permission. "I came down into this town the way I come most market days," I said. "In a plain cloak, to walk among my own people as a man, because up in that hold every soul I meet has already decided what I am before I open my mouth. And then a flood took the low town, and I went the wrong way down a lane because a woman was shouting, and I put my hand to your rope and I broke your gate, and you turned around to tell me what I was." My voice was steady. I made it steady. "And the moment you turned around, Linnet, the moment you looked at me and saw an ox with no sense who'd pitched your goat in a flood, something woke in me that has been asleep since before your grandmother's grandmother was born. 200 years my line has been called moon-forsaken. 200 years a veil has waited for the bond to strike and been told the kings don't get one. I'd made my peace with it. I was 9 days from declaring it dead forever and giving my crown to a cousin's child. I stopped. I made myself say the whole of it. It struck in your flooded yard while you were calling me useless. You are my fated mate. My wolf has known it since the first hour. He thinks, Moon help me, he thinks every time you scold me it's the sweetest thing anyone's ever said, and I could never talk him out of it because I think so too. The yard was very quiet. Even the goose had stopped. So that's the true thing, I said. I didn't stay for 8 days because I was hiding a crown. I stayed because for 8 days you were the only person alive who ever made me mend my own fence, and I would rather have been a stray in your straw than a king in my hold, and I was a coward about it, and I'm sorry, and I'll go. I looked down at the pups. The pups are moon wolves, royal blood. They were lost from my kennels in the flood and washed up in your yard, and they stayed. They took your hand milk when they'd have pined and died for anyone else. The moon wolf chooses one soul in a generation. You should know they chose you before I ever did. I bent and gently unwound the smallest one from around my ankle and set it down facing her. It went to her at once. Of course it did. It pressed itself flat against her boot in the ancient way and would not leave. Keep them, I said. They're yours now, whatever you decide about me. A king's purse couldn't buy what you already have. And I turned to go. I made it 4 steps. I want that in the record too, for honesty's sake. I was leaving, truly leaving. I had my back to her and Holly's at my shoulder and my heart in my boots, and I made it 4 steps across her muddy yard toward the lane. Stop, said Linnet. I stopped. Turn around. I turned around. She was standing where I'd left her, and the smallest pup was pressed to her boot, and the fury was gone off her face, and something far more frightening had come up in its place, which was that she was thinking. Linnet thinking was a force to level towns. She looked at me the long, assessing way, from the shoulders to the eyes, recataloguing me one final time, and I watched her run it all through. The ox, the stray, the liar, the king, the hunt, the mare, the fence set twice, the badger, the pups, the 200 years. And weigh it item by honest item on the scales she weighed wounded creatures on, the ones that decided what could be saved. You waited 200 years, she said slowly, and it struck you while I was calling you an ox. Yes. And your wolf thinks when I'm shouting at you, I'm courting him. Yes, there's no reasoning with him, I've tried. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. She fought it. She was too angry and too proud and too newly betrayed to let it out. And it happened anyway, the smallest twitch, the ghost of the thing that in a fair world would have been a laugh. That, she said, is the stupidest thing I have ever heard in my life. I know. 200 years of a moon-forsaken line, and the moon finally wakes your wolf up in a flood, pointed at a woman throwing rags at your head, and it decides my badger threat was a love poem. Word for word how he took it, yes. He's an idiot, she said, and her voice broke, but it broke the other way this time, toward the laugh she was still refusing to give me, and one tear went down her muddy face, and she scrubbed it away furious that it had escaped. He is, I agreed. He's a hopeless, glad, 200-year starved idiot, and he loves you, and I can't get him to be sensible, and the plain truth, Linnet, under all the rest of it, is that neither can I. She did not fall into my arms. I want that understood, because the ballads will surely have her fall into my arms, and Linnet has never fallen into anything in her life except a flood on purpose to save a goat. She threw me off her land. Get off my land, she said, the both of you, and take your kneeling steward and give me a day. You don't drop fated mate, and I'm the king, and these are magic wolves on a woman before she's had her tea and expect an answer. I have animals to see to. I have a fence you set crooked to fix. Go and be a king somewhere and come back tomorrow, and knock, and I'll tell you what I've decided. And Torin, she said as I reached the lane, and I turned, and she was standing there among her saved creatures with the king's own moonwolf at her boot, muddy and magnificent and unbowed. Come back on foot, in your own cloak, not on a horse at a gallop with a purse. If you come back as the man who mended my fence, I'll open the gate. If you come back as a king, I'll set the badger on you. Do you understand the difference? I've only just learned it, I said, but yes. I went up the hill. I will not pretend the day that followed was a small thing, because it was not. I went up to Highhearth and I was a king again, and it fit worse than it ever had, like a coat you've grown out of without noticing. The council was in an uproar. Hollies had held the county together by his fingernails. There were 9 kinds of business a flood leaves behind. I did all of it. But I did it differently, and everyone felt the difference, and no one could name it, and it was this. I had for 8 days been the ground under a hunt. I knew now what my kingdom looked like from underneath. I sat in my council that afternoon and heard the tally of the flood, the stalls lost, the low town's ruin, the purse to be sent, and I stood up in the middle of it and said no. No purse. I would go down myself. I would see what was broken with my own eyes, and mend what my own hands could mend, and pay for the rest to the faces of the people I'd flattened. And I would do it every season, hunt or no hunt. Because a king who mends only from horseback is not a kind king. He is only a rich one. And I had been a rich one for 200 years, and it had cost me a mare I never saw, and very nearly cost me the only home I'd ever had. Hollies, who had known me since I was a pup, listened to all of this and did not argue. He came to me afterward when the council had emptied out, and he was quiet a while, and then he said, "There's a light in you that wasn't there a fortnight ago, sire. I've served the Vales all my life, and I know what that light is. I never thought I'd see it in this line." He paused. The moon wolves, the lost litter, they truly stayed with the mender, took her hand. "They chose her," I said, "before I did." "Then it's no idle bond," said Holly softly. "The moon wolf doesn't choose false, sire," and the old man's voice went rough. The line was never forsaken, it was only waiting, and it waited for her. Whatever she decides tomorrow, go down on foot, go as the man. If she's the one the moon held 200 years to give this line, you don't win her with a crown. You'd only frighten off the truest thing that ever happened to us. I looked at my steward, who had spent a decade steering me toward giving up, and who was now, with tears in his old eyes, telling me not to. "You wanted me to name the cousin's boy," I said. "I wanted you to stop being alone," said Hollies. "I thought that was the kindest end I could steer you to, because I never once believed the other end could come. I was wrong, and I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong. Go down the hill, sire, knock on her gate." There is one more thing to tell of that night, and it is the thing that decided the morning, though I did not arrange it and could not have. Sometime past midnight, unable to sleep, I went down to the royal kennels to look on the moon wolves, the grown ones, the great pale wolves of my line, who had let no hand but mine near them in 2 centuries. And I found them awake, all of them, standing at the kennel gates, ears pricked, noses to the wind that came up the hill from the low town, from Thistledown, from a certain flooded yard, restless, yearning, facing down the hill toward the one thing in the kingdom that had ever called their lost pups home. The eldest, a great scarred she-wolf who had run at my father's side, turned her head and looked at me, and there was a question in it as old as the moon, and I understood it, because my own wolf had been asking me the same thing for 9 days. "Is it her? Is it finally her? Do we get to stop waiting?" "I don't know yet," I told the she-wolf honestly. "She's thinking. She throws things when she's thinking, but I hope so. Moon, I hope so." The she-wolf held my eyes a moment longer. Then she lay down, facing the hill, facing the low town, and settled her great head on her paws to wait out the night, pointed at the yard where her grandpups slept. And one by one the whole pale pack lay down beside her, all of them facing the same way, down the hill, toward Linnet. And I stood in my own kennel in the dark and watched 200 years of a forsaken line turn as one body toward a muddy refuge and a plain-spoken woman. And I knew what the morning had to hold, whatever she decided, because the moon had already decided, and had been deciding patiently for 2 centuries. And its whole answer was asleep at that moment against a blind hound in Linnet's straw. At dawn I put on my own plain cloak, and I took no horse, and I told the guard to stay, and I walked down the hill on my own 2 feet, and I knocked on Linnet's gate. She opened it. She'd had her tea, I could tell by the set of her. Behind her the yard was already loud with mourning, the goose, the goat, the 4 pups tumbling underfoot. She looked at me on her threshold, on foot, in my worn cloak, mud already on my boots, no crown, no horse, no purse, and she looked me up and down the long assessing way one last time. "On foot," she said. "On foot. Own cloak. Own cloak. No purse. No purse, 2 hands, both terrible you'll recall, good for carrying no sense at all, but they mend a fence if a woman shows them twice." The corner of her mouth did the thing again. This time she let it. It bloomed into a smile that undid me completely, the first full smile she had ever given me, and it was worth more than the whole of my kingdom, and I would have said so if I'd trusted my voice. "I sat up half the night with it," she said. "Do you know what I decided?" She didn't wait. Linnet never waits. I decided you're an ox with no sense who broke my gate and lied in my straw for 8 days and let me insult a king to his face, and that the king of Sunhallow is a careless, purse-sending man who galloped over my mare and never saw me. She lifted her chin. And then I decided those are the same man, and I have to make room in my head for that, because I watched you set my post again when I told you to, and I've never met a king who'd set a post twice for anyone, and I've certainly never met one who'd rather sleep in my straw than his own hold. Her voice gentled and roughened. And I thought about the mare, and I thought the man who killed her wouldn't feel terrible about a goat. He'd send a purse. And you didn't send a purse, Torin. You dug my drainage and you fed my badger and you let it bite you and you stayed up all night worrying over a splint. Those aren't a king's hands. Those are a man's. She reached out and took one of my terrible, mending hands in both of hers. So here's what I've decided. I'm not marrying a crown. I don't want your hold and I don't want your court and I won't be curtsied at. I'd sooner die. But the ox who mends my fences, and her voice broke warm, the good break, the ox can stay. The ox can keep coming down the hill on foot in his own cloak forever and mend things and be scolded and be told he's got water in his eyes and no sense at all. And if that's a Luna, if you're kind, will let a Luna be a woman who splints goats and shouts at her king across a courtyard, then, she pulled my hand to her. Then that's how it starts. But you tell that idiot wolf of yours the shouting is shouting, do you hear me? It's not a love poem. I mean every word of it every time. She said forever, my wolf whispered incandescent. She said the ox can stay forever. That was a love poem. She's getting better at them. He heard you, I told her, and I could barely speak for the joy of it. He says he understands completely. He's lying. He thinks that whole speech was the most romantic thing ever spoken, and he's never going to believe otherwise as long as he lives. He's an idiot, said Lynette, laughing now, really laughing, the tears going down her face the good way, and she pulled me down by my terrible mending hands over her mended gate. And she kissed me, she kissing me on her own threshold, on her own terms, having decided it herself the way she decided everything. And behind her in the yard, the 4 moonwolf pups set up a delighted racket, and up on the hill, though we could not hear it. I knew the whole pale pack of my forsaken line had risen from where they lay facing the low town, and were, for the first time in 200 years, running home. That was years ago now. The refuge is still hers. She would not move it up the hill, and she would not let me build her a grand one. She runs it exactly as she ran it, muddy and crooked and overfull, except that now it is under a Luna's protection, and no hunt will ever come within a mile of it while I draw breath. And I ride at the back of my own hunts now, slowly, watching the ground. She comes up to High Hearth when she pleases, and not a moment sooner, and she does not curtsy, and the court has learned to love her for it, and she has taught half my kennel boys to splint a leg and shamed my whole council into going down the hill on foot. The Moonwolf line has pups again, real pups, our pups, the forsaken blood unforsaken, and the eldest she-wolf, my father's old companion, sleeps at Lynette's feet by our fire every night, having decided, as her grandpups did, that this plain, loud woman is the truest thing our line ever found, which she is. And this is the part I would tell any young king who thinks the moon has passed him by, if the ballads ever let me get a word in. It is not, in the end, a grand thing, the bond. It does not arrive with trumpets. It arrives in a flood at the worst moment, aimed at the last person you'd choose, and it breaks all your gates, and it makes you set the post again. That is the whole of it. That is how you know. Yesterday she was across the courtyard, up to her elbows in a foaling ewe, and I did something wrong. I don't even know what. I never do. And she straightened up and put her bloody hands on her hips and shouted the length of the whole hold that I was an ox with no sense who'd be more use as a fence post, in front of my entire assembled council and 3 visiting lords. And my wolf, 200 and some years old, king's blood, scarred, wise, lay down in the sun in the middle of the courtyard and thumped his tail like a fool. I let him, I always let him, because he waited 2 centuries to be that happy, and because, whatever she says, and she says a great deal, I have come to agree with him about what her shouting means. That's how it started, that's how it goes on. And I would not trade 1 word of it, or 1 mended fence, or 1 swimming goat, for all the quiet crowns in the world.